Good morning, learners. Welcome back to the grade 11 session and this is the last part of environmental studies that we're going to be discussing, and that is sustaining the environment. Okay, first of all, we have to look at the word sustaining. What do we understand by the meaning of the word sustaining? It simply means to ensure that the environmental resources that are present will be there for the future. It's not all used up. So in this particular session, we're going to be discussing what are the ways to prevent over-exploitation of our natural resources and ways to ensure that the future generations will still have all the available resources that we have today. Right. We are now going to look at the definition of sustainability. It's the methods used to conserve. It's a method used to conserve, okay, methods used to conserve the environment and the natural resources available for future generations. So the main thing, it is a method that is implemented to ensure that the resources like water, soil, air, right, all the plants, the animals that are available today will be there in future. Right, so our future generations will be able to use these effectively. Ecotourism. Right, this is a word that often comes out in the form of a definition or in the biological terms, and many of the learners confuse it with ecology. Ecotourism simply means it is a responsible travel, it is a form of responsible travel to natural areas where the environment is conserved and where the well-being of the local inhabitants is improved. Ecotourism helps conserve biodiversity. Now, what does this all mean? First of all, ecotourism simply means that tourists are attracted to a particular area to visit one of those natural heritage sites. For example, people may come from overseas to visit the Table Mountain. That's a natural site, a natural beauty of Cape Town in South Africa. So they will travel to Cape Town to see the Table Mountain, go up the the cable cars, pay for it, and the payment that they have actually the payment that they're making towards visiting that site is going to be used to maintain that area, to maintain Table Mountain, so that it's there for future generations. Visiting the Kruger National Park in Mpumalanga, for example, they have to pay to enter, so that that money is used to maintain that park, to maintain the animals, to feed the animals, and to provide an income for those that look after the park. So that is ecotourism. It's a responsible travel to natural areas where the environment is conserved and where the well-being of the local inhabitants is improved. Visiting, for example, the Sidwala caves in Mpumalanga, right? The money that you pay there is going to be used to maintain that natural resource, to show you the caves, to show you the stalagmites, the stalactites, and places where the caveman lived and the ancestors have actually lived. So ecotourism is a responsible form of travel. It ensures that that biodiversity of the natural area will be protected and conserved. One of the very important aspects we're going to be looking at in this section is the waste management in South Africa. Not only in South Africa, but in the globe itself. A lot of waste, millions of tons of waste is produced daily due to the high population explosion, due to the growing economy, due to the growing industries and factories that are being built. There is more and more waste that is being produced every day. and the areas to actually dispose of the waste is becoming very, very limited. So we're going to look at waste management, how to actually manage our waste or reduce the waste. First of all, we look at the legislation. Remember, legislation means a law. Managers of dumping sites must have a permit from the Department of Water Affairs and Environmental Affairs. So a person cannot take, for example, a builder cannot take all the rubbish of the bricks and the plastics and the rubble and dump it just anywhere where he finds an open spot. He needs to have a permit provided by the Department of Water Affairs, Department of Environmental Affairs. He needs to have that permit, and he needs to know which area is a legal form of a dumping site. And then he would dump that waste there, whereby that waste will be used for rubble to build factories where they can actually put it underground, and it can be used in that form rather than defacing the environment. So they need to have a permit. Anybody that disposes waste needs to have a permit, a legal permit. Right. Some of the strategies for efficient waste management. Right, Pick It Up is one of the stakeholders involved in removing our waste, and thereafter, where is our waste being disposed of? Remember that we need to use the 3 R's. The 3 R's. The first one is we need to know that we must recycle our waste. Waste needs to be recycled. Now, people, every item that you buy, right, it is a law that the manufacturing companies have to comply with manufacturing items or packaging that are recyclable. Therefore, the price of items have increased because the designing of the packaging has to be recyclable, right? Once the waste is recycled, right, it will the amount of waste will be reduced. If we reuse our waste, the waste will be reduced. So recycling and reusing will actually reduce the amount of waste produced by the commercial, industrial, and domestic sectors. We're going to see actually what are the methods that we can reuse, what is recycling, and how can we reduce it. What happens to our environment when there is illegal dumping near residential areas, illegal dumping near lakes, illegal dumping near velds, right? It defaces the environment. The environment becomes ugly. It's unsuitable, right? Nobody really wants to sit there and enjoy it as if it's a park. Nobody wants to sit near bricks and rubble. So it defaces that environment. Waste attracts pests such as rats that spread diseases. Rats, cockroaches, these are the pests that are going to use that illegal dumping site as a breeding ground. They're going to breed rapidly, and then these rodents and these cockroaches would get into our homes. Right? So what we have done will eventually affect us. Our illegal dumping will create rodents, create pests, which will affect us eventually. So one, it defaces the environment, it attracts pests, and then decaying organic waste, example, dead animals release methane gas causing global warming. Remember, in the first session, we spoke about greenhouse gases, and one of the greenhouse gases that's the most is methane. It is absolutely flammable. Methane is produced by the decomposition of waste and dead animals that are dumped illegally, and this releases methane. So that smell of stagnant air is actually the methane that is being smelled. So decaying organic waste, example, dead animals release methane, and methane will trap carbon dioxide, acting as a blanket, contributing to the global warming. Waste that are burnt emits greenhouse gases, example, nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. Right. If waste are incinerated or burnt down, remember that decomposition releases methane, but when you burn, if things are burnt, old clothes, animals, vegetable matter, once they're burnt, you release sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide, which are all part of the harmful greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming. Right, so you can get marks for effects of illegal dumping. It defaces the environment, attracts pests, they release methane when the animals decompose, and waste that are burnt releases the toxic fumes. So this is all part related to the last session, that is land or soil pollution. Right. Now we're going to look at what are some of the methods of reducing the waste. Reduce waste that needs to be thrown away. Find people who generate too much of waste. So now the municipality needs to find people to say, look, each household needs to produce so many kilos of waste per day. More than that, you would be fined. So they need to generate a law to say that people need to limit the amount of waste disposed of daily. That's domestic waste. So fines need to be imposed on those that dispose of too much of waste. So obviously the people will now look for alternative methods. I'm not going to throw away waste like this. I'm going to use it again, and then that will actually bring the amount of waste down. So reduce waste that needs to be thrown away. For example, if you are peeling carrots and cutting lettuce and making a salad, all the peels and the vegetable litter can be put into your vegetable garden at the back. It can be used as a compost heap to fertilize the soil. So there's no need to buy fertilizers. You can fertilize the soil by using the vegetable matter instead of throwing it into the bin. Throw it into the garden, turn the soil, and all the nutrients found in the peels can be turned into compost or fertilizer. And you can have your own vegetable garden there, which will actually help you to save money. You'll save money. Instead of buying tomatoes, you can grow your own tomatoes. Instead of buying onions, you can grow your own onions by fertilizing your soil with the organic waste. And thereby you reduce the amount of waste that you dispose of daily into your dustbins. Reuse the waste. Reuse. Now, if you look at Clover, the little containers of fresh cream that Clover has now put into containers that they look like little Tupperwares. So once you've used the cream, instead of discarding that container into the dustbin, you can use it to fill up sauces or any other item that you may need a container which is sealable and can be put into the freezer or the fridge, right, without it breaking. So these containers are expensive, but they can be reused for a number of times. So you don't now. The environment is not over-exploited to make silica, to make plastic and things like that. So reuse containers for milk, your cool drink bottles, right? The cool drink bottles, for example, once you buy cool drink and then you give them you give back the bottle, you will get a rand back because that bottle is going to be washed and reused. So instead of taking off more raw materials to make glass, the bottles can be reused. Plastic containers can be reused. Right. Reuse containers for milk, cold drink, and alcohol to reduce demand and allow money to be saved. Remember that waste management can actually generate income for those that are unemployed. So those people that are unemployed can go around, collect all these pieces of paper and plastic, take it to the recycling company where this waste can be recycled, and by them collecting the waste and taking it to the company, they are actually going to get a small amount of money which they can use for themselves. So waste management generates income. Right. Recycling of waste. Now, recycling of waste means whatever you use, for example, if you use technology to renew used products, example, metal, cans, paper, and glass. So recycling companies have special forms of machines which can take your paper, take your plastic, and then change them into another form which can be used. Right. Recycling of waste creates awareness that waste can generate income. Teach low-income groups to use organic waste to make composts. There you are using your vegetable matter now to make compost, so the nutrients are going back into the soil. You're getting more crops. You use the crops, you put the peels back, so now it's being recycled. Right. So teach low-income groups to use organic waste to make compost to create fertile soil for food crops. Encourage people to separate waste into different containers for recycling. Now the municipality should think about another strategy. Instead of supplying only the black bins, they can supply different colored bins, a green bin for glass, a black bin for paper, okay, a red bin for probably cans, so that people have 3 different bins and 3 different types of waste into each bin, which means that the waste is not mixed up. Now, the government does not need to pay more money on sorting out the waste. The waste is already sorted. They can rather use that money to build a home or to recycle the waste and prevent over-exploitation of the natural resources like metal, like iron and steel that is needed to use to formulate cans. Encourage people to separate waste into different containers for recycling. So please remember, this is a very important question. They can ask you, what strategies can be used to reduce waste? What are some of the strategies that can be used? Management strategies. Right. The municipality can provide different colored bins to dispose of the various kinds of waste. Example, glass, paper, and cans. That's 1. 2, you can educate people or low-income groups that they can use organic waste as a compost heap so their soil becomes fertile to grow the crops, so they no longer need to buy food. They can get their own food crops grown in the garden. That's the second one. Then they can recycle, buy items that are recyclable, where that material, once it's used, once it's disposed of into the bin, it will be recycled to make another. For example, your ShopRite packets and your Pick and Pay packets, right? Once they are disposed of, those packets can be recycled to make dustbin packets. So it's recycled. There's no need to take off more resources to make the plastics. Right, then you got to reuse. Reuse the containers, wash them off and reuse them instead of constantly rebuying. Right, so you can take, for example, your milk bottles. Once you've used your milk bottles, you can wash them. You go to, for example, a dairy near you or fruit and veg, and you just fill it up with milk. So instead of buying a carton of milk again, you can just use the very same bottle to fill it with milk. Right. So that's the way we can reuse our waste, we can recycle, and by doing that and forming a compost heap, we reduce the amount of waste that's being produced. Okay. We now go to over-exploitation of indigenous resources. Now, as man, although there's modern technology and as the human population is increasing and there's more and more diseases, people are turning to natural forms of remedy, and that is going more to using indigenous plants like the devil's claw, okay, the African potato, right? These are some of the things that are being exploited and to treat illnesses in people. Right. The increasing population is placing high demands on the fishing industry. More and more people, because of high cholesterol levels, they refuse to eat red meat, which is beef and your lamb. They rather go for eating fish, and this is creating an they are overusing the amount of fish that's found in the sea. There's more fish that's being eaten than any other form of protein. So it's an increasing demand on the fishing industry. Overuse of medicinal plants such as the devil's claw, which is used as an anti-inflammatory, is near extinction. Right. So the output, that means they are taking more devil's claw out than what they are replanting, and that's causing the devil's claw to reach extinction. Also the African potato. All right. So that's also becoming a nearly extinct. the pepperbark tree, the bark of this tree is used to treat respiratory infections like chest infections, bronchitis, pneumonia. They just grind the pepperbark into a powder and then they drink it to actually cure chest infections and stomach infections as well. So when people have cramps in the stomach or severe diarrhea, they drink the powder of the pepperbark, and that relieves them of the sickness. But at the same time, the pepperbark and the devil's claw is being overexploited. Right, we're going to look at this question. Study the passage below and answer the questions that follow. Right, devil's claw. Now you have a species and a genus name. The species name is Harpagophytum procumbens. Harpagophytum is the genus name. Procumbens is a species name. Okay, they don't normally ask you that name. They normally use the normal biological terminology, devil's claw. This is the genus name. It's found most commonly on the South African high veld and is believed to cure a variety of illnesses. It does not have an odor, but it contains substances that make it taste bitter. So there's no odor, but it tastes bitter. It's a leafy perennial. It means that the devil claw is a leafy plant. It has leaves, and perennial means it is there throughout the year. With branching roots, and it thrives in clay and sandy soils. The fact that it can thrive in clay and sandy soils means it's found near a river, right, where there's more clay and there's more sand. So it's found near sandy or near areas where there are rivers. It has a secondary root tuber, which are used for medicinal purposes. The devil's claw is bitter. It's a sedative and pain-killing herb that reduces inflammation and stimulates the digestive system. So there are many actual uses for the devil's claw from this passage. The fact that you say it's a sedative means it helps a person who suffers from insomnia. People who do not sleep, if they take the devil's claw, it's obviously going to help them to be more relaxed, right? Although it is bitter. It's pain-killing. It means it's analgesic, which means it relieves you of pain. And it relieves inflammation or swelling at the joints, and people normally use that for arthritis. It stimulates the digestive system. It can be given to children who have a poor appetite, so it increases the appetite. It can also prevent a person from having severe diarrhea or stomach cramps. Right, let's look at the question relating to the devil's claw. What is the habitat of the devil's claw? Now, what do we mean by habitat? It means where exactly would you find the devil's claw? Which areas would you find the devil's claw? Right, and if you wrote there the South African high veld, that is, and this should not be confused with what conditions are suitable for the devil's claw to live in. So what climatic conditions or environmental conditions are suitable, that would be the sandy soils, sandy and the clay soils. Right. So these are the soils that are suitable. So please remember, the habitat is not a sandy soil or a clay soil. That is not the habitat, because sandy soils and clay soils are found almost everywhere on earth. So the actual place where you'll find the devil's claw will be the South African high veld. Okay. We look at the same questions again. Name 2 medicinal conditions that can be treated with the devil's claw. Now, normally children will not read the passage and they will put any kind of a condition. Right. To get the 2 marks, read, and then obviously, sometimes if you need to know a little bit more, you need to think, what is inflammation? Okay, inflammation of the joints. So if you say, inflammation of the joints, That's coming directly from the passage. Or if you say arthritis, treating arthritis, that is correct, because arthritis is an inflammation that is found within your joints. So inflammation of the joints, but you cannot say inflammation and then arthritis. You would not get two separate marks, because it means one and the same thing. So inflammation or arthritis, that's the first condition. And the second condition is to treat digestive disorders. For example, stomach cramps. So stomach cramps or digestive illnesses. That is an alternative to digestive illnesses, stomach cramps. So these are the two conditions that can be treated medically with this herb. Right. Go to the next one. Name 2 ways in which the habitat of the devil's claw plant could become lost or reduced. That means the area where it's being found, that South African highveld, how can that habitat be lost for the devil's claw? The first one is where we're looking at building of homes, industries, and schools. So once we've selected an area where we have to build something, the habitat or that part, that area where the devil's claw will be located will be now totally lost. We are removing that devil's claw. The second one is because of the growing population, there's an increased demand for food. So with regards to agriculture, more food crops need to be grown, and obviously the natural habitat of that devil's claw will be removed. So for agricultural purposes to grow food crops. Remember, in the previous session, we've discussed human influences on the environment, whereby natural forests are removed to grow plantations of pine trees. And in that way as well, if there was a devil's claw that was in that habitat, it would also be removed. So commercial farming and agricultural purposes, those are some of the contributors to removing the habitat of the devil's claw. Agricultural purposes, commercial farming, the building of homes and industries and schools will destroy the habitat of the devil's claw. 1.4. Explain how a reduction in the number of devil's claw plants can change the energy flow and energy relationships in an ecosystem. Now we talk about the energy flow, like we are now looking at the food chains and the food webs, and obviously you're going to look at the trophic levels in an ecosystem. Remember, to answer this question, you have to know what is a devil's claw. Obviously it is a plant, it's a producer. So if we over-exploit the devil's claw, there's going to be a shortage of food on that primary consumer or herbivore that fed on the devil's claw. So obviously now the food chain is going to be affected. So the first thing is that you've got to answer is that the devil's claw is a producer in an ecosystem. Remember, what is an ecosystem? It's an area where the living, that is the biotic, and the abiotic factors interact. It is an area, a specific area where biotic and abiotic factors interact. So the devil's claw is a producer in an ecosystem, and therefore low numbers will reduce the number of primary consumers that feed on the devil's claw. This in turn will reduce the number of secondary consumers. So that means the total energy in that food web will, or food chain, will be reduced. So the energy flow will be reduced. Remember, the devil's claw is a leafy plant. It photosynthesizes, it stores food, it gets energy directly from the sun. So that is the total source of energy for the primary consumer and for the secondary consumer. It's an indirect source. So reducing the number of devil's claw will reduce the number of primary consumers that feed on the devil's claw, and then there's not going to be enough food for the secondary consumer that feeds on the primary consumer, thereby decreasing the total energy flow. And there we are talking about the relationships, the relationship between the producer, primary, and secondary consumer. So that is how you have to answer the question. You talk about the energy flow, the energy relationships. You've got to talk about the producer. It will reduce the amount of food for the primary consumer, and this will in turn reduce the number of secondary consumers, and the energy flow will be reduced. So if you look at it, there's a total of 5 points. So if you write that, you can get at least a maximum of 3. Name 2 ways in which the devil's claw plant can be saved from exploitation. How can we now sustain it? How can we ensure that there is sufficient devil's claw that can be used for our future generations? What are the 2 ways in which we can do that? Right, the first way is that we can establish nurseries. We can have nurseries that only grow devil's claw. So you can establish nurseries. Remember, we don't want to write too much. You must always look at the mark allocation. Establish nurseries. But if there was 2 ways, and if it was 4 marks, then you would have to give a reason for your statement. Then you would say, establish nurseries to ensure that more devil claws are planted than what's been taken out. Right, so establish nurseries, that's the 1 mark. Okay, so now we're just looking at, remember, just 2. Establish nurseries. Number 2, we got to limit. The government got to ensure that the number of devil claws that are harvested are limited for that season. So you got to limit the amount that is harvested. Limit amount that is harvested. Right. And we said 2 ways. Name 2. Establish nurse, limit the amount that is harvested. And now remember, they spoke about it has secondary root tubers which are used for medicinal purposes. So now the devil's plant has a primary tuber, and then it's got all these secondary tubers here. And it is these secondary tubers that I actually used for medicinal purposes. Now, if you don't use the secondary tuber and now you're going to use the primary tuber, you are not going to get any more secondary tubers because you're getting rid of the part that is responsible for more production. So ensure that you use the secondary tubers and not just the primary. The primary tuber can be replanted. So what you can do is, the next point is, you can say replant the primary tuber. You can replant the primary tubers. So limit the amount that is harvested, establish nurseries, and replant the primary tubers. So those are, I've given you 3 instead of 2, 3 strategies in which we can prevent over-exploitation of the devil's claw. Okay, we go into question 2, which deals with an extract that you've got to read and underline the important words because it's quite a long extract. So if we go through the text an ever-growing economy, expanding population, rapid increase in visitor numbers, and the unsustainable consumption patterns are all contributing to Cape Town's significant waste problem. Okay, so if you look at the first paragraph, we got to analyze now what is the growing economy. It's actually a whole lot of industries and commercial sectors that are developing due to the increasing population. Expanding, rapid increase in visitor numbers and unsustainable consumption. That means Cape Town is a tourist attraction where it is attracting a lot of visitors, and that they are also contributing to the amount of waste that is being disposed. Right, approximately 6,000 tons, if you look at this, right, let's go to the top, approximately 6,000 tons of waste are generated. 55% ends up in the 6 landfill sites, right? And that's coming from the industrial and commercial sectors. The domestic waste is coming from the household. So that domestic waste is coming from the household. That is all the litter that you dispose of into the waste, into the bins. And that is 30%. So 30% is actually your domestic waste. 55% is your industrial and commercial waste. And the remaining comes from the sewage or sludge that is being released as wastewater. If you look at this here, you find that in 2002, there was actually 1.6 million tons of waste, right? In 2002, and then it was 2002 was 1.7. In 2001, it was 1.6, and in 2000, it was 1.5. So that means from the year 2000 to the year 2002, there has been a general increase in the amount of waste that's generated. That actually estimates to approximately 7% increase annually. Waste from the lower income groups are shown to contain more organic waste. So the domestic waste that's coming into the landfill sites contains more organic waste. Most of the waste that's coming from the domestic sector is organic waste, and that is coming from the lower income households. Right, and then the affluent suburbs. Affluent means the higher income groups. If you want to put it, the richer people, their waste is more from packaging items, packaging waste. Of the total amount of waste produced, 90% is the landfill. That means the 6 landfill sites are almost filled to capacity in Cape Town. Therefore, there's an urgent need for a new landfill site. So there's a new landfill site that needs to be built, plus there's an urgent need for management to implement proper strategies. As the city faces the closure of most of its current landfill sites, that's because it's almost filled, cleanup costs of litter and dumping exceed 100 million a year. 100 million a year spent on dumping and cleaning up is a lot of money, and that money could be put to a greater use, especially with regards to the housing crisis. So they can actually build homes instead of sorting out all the waste. Now let us look at the questions. Much of the waste that is deposited on the landfill has further uses, and many people live on and around these landfill sites to collect these items. So much of the waste that is deposited on the landfills has further uses, and many people live on and around these landfill sites to collect these items. List 3 possible dangers to the health of the people who live in this environment, and that's 3 marks. Okay, now we're going to extend that page and let us look at what are the possible dangers to the health of the people who live in this environment. The first thing you must remember that the people who live in the landfill site picking up those items are homeless people. So they are going to actually use up some of the waste that is deposited in there, in that place, and it's going to endanger their health. So the first thing that can happen is there's an incineration process whereby certain waste is being burnt. once it's burned, toxic fumes are released. So the incineration process will lead to inhaling toxic fumes, which will lead to respiratory diseases. So the incineration process at a landfill sites have an incinerator or a furnace whereby certain waste is burnt, and that process releases toxic fumes, and this is inhaled by those people around the dumping sites or the landfill sites. The second thing is that there's going to be the leaching of hazardous chemicals into the groundwater. So there's going to be leaching of hazardous chemicals into the groundwater. And remember, that groundwater could also be used as borehole water. So if there's boreholes around there, that same water is going to be used by the local residents, but at the same time, chemicals have seeped into that groundwater and it's going to harm the health of those that live in that area. So leaching of hazardous chemicals into the groundwater will be consumed by the residents. Right, and remember they said 3 possible dangers. So one is inhaling, one is the leaching of chemicals into the water, and the third one is the transmission of disease carrying bacteria. So those items will be taken by the people. They will drink from some of those items. They will use it because there's no taps available. They will use it. They will put their hands into their mouths, and in that way, diseases like cholera, dysentery, typhoid are transmitted to the people. So the transmission of disease-carrying organisms will be transmitted. Right. Also, you find that because of all the waste that is dumped on the landfill site, it can also irritate the nasal membranes, the eye membranes, so it can also cause hay fever. It can cause skin and eye irritations, skin and eye irritations. Right. So therefore you have at least 4 of them. Incineration, that means you inhale. You're going to drink up water that's contaminated. They're going to get disease, and obviously they're going to have skin and eye irritations. Okay, we go to question 2.2 relating to the same text. Landfills are known to cause pollution of the environment. Briefly describe 2 possible ways in which this could happen. So what the question is actually asking for, what are the 2 ways in which landfill sites can cause pollution to areas? Right. The first way, okay. Right, the first way that this can happen is, remember that the landfill site has a lot of litter in it, and it can only be covered once the litter is completely full. So the wind can blow, wind blows. The wind blows the litter into the parks and the yards and the rivers and dams, and eventually ends up in the sea. So it's the wind that will blow that litter from the landfill sites into other areas, defacing the environment. The second way, how else can the waste in the landfill site actually pollute the environment? Okay, the next one is the leaching of hazardous chemicals. Leaching of hazardous chemicals, right? Example, mercury into the groundwater. Right, so it actually causes pollution to the groundwater, to the groundwater. So the groundwater is polluted. People who drink from boreholes, that water will be polluted. So there are how many ways now we've looked at? 2 ways: the wind blowing it, causing land pollution or litter, and then the leaching of hazardous chemicals, example, mercury. And then remember, if the people around, they begin to keep themselves warm, they'll start burning off some waste, and then they will inhale all that smoke and toxic fumes. So the inhalation of harmful gases when waste is burnt. Right. So that is how landfills are known to cause pollution. The first one is going to cause land pollution and water pollution. The second one is leading to water pollution. And the third one, the fact that the gases can go into the air, it's going to lead to air pollution and also going to affect the health of the people around that area. Right, the next question. Okay, give one way in which lower income households could reduce the amount of waste that they send to landfills. Remember that the lower income households, the waste is 80% is organic waste. So one way in which they can reduce that waste is by educating them to put that waste into a compost heap. So they can be educated to deposit the organic waste into a compost heap to be used as fertilizer. And in this way, the waste can be reduced. So that is one mark. And the fact that it says educated to form a compost heap, that is one total mark for the way they can reduce their organic waste. Right, the next question. Now the next question is a flow diagram, right? So you have to use, it illustrates a broad strategy that could be employed to reduce waste. So this is the flow diagram indicating to municipalities or government what are the ways that they can implement to reduce the amount of waste and to save money. Right, so let us look at this flow diagram. Here is where the raw materials are extracted from the earth, used by industries in the manufacturing processes. Right, products are formed to be used by the consumers. Once that product is used, it's the end of its life. If it's thrown into the bin, right, or if it's thrown onto the ground, it will not end up in the recycling bin, but it will end up in the rivers or dams or on land, causing pollution. But if that product is used and it goes into a recycling bin, then obviously that raw material is now recovered and then it can be used again. So here comes the compost heap, whereby the lower income group can be educated to put the organic waste to form a compost heap. Therefore, you are recovering all the nutrients into the soil, which is going to be used to grow crops again, saving them a lot of money. Right. Then you have to look at this: rethink, redesign, reduce and repair. That is a form of waste prevention, but for who? It is for the stakeholders or the industries to rethink and redesign their packaging items. Make sure that their packaging items are actually recyclable. Make sure that they redesign the glass bottles, the plastic containers, so that there'll be less waste, or there'll be a reduction in waste. And then obviously that's going to repair our environment. Now, looking at this flow diagram and putting all this, we're going to look at how can we actually form an essay for around 7 marks, a mini essay. Right, discuss how Cape Town municipality could implement these ideas to reduce the amount of waste. The first thing, remember, as a management strategy must be an educational campaign. So you've got to educate the residents on the way to dispose of that organic waste, which forms 80% of the household waste. So educate the residents on how to dispose organic waste in order to reduce waste in landfill sites. Remember that organic waste, once it's deposited into the landfill site, it forms an attraction for pests such as rats. They will feed on that organic waste. So if that organic waste is lying rather in the compost heap, turning to the soil, it will be decomposed by the bacteria, turning it into nutrients or fertilizer. So these residents need to be educated that if you deposit this, you're going to attract more rodents into your home, more cockroaches into your home, more rats into your homes. So educate the residents on how to dispose organic waste in order to reduce the waste in the landfill sites. The second thing, they need all the stakeholders from the manufacturers to the consumers need to be educated on the actual landfill sites that are being filled. So all stakeholders, which are the manufacturers, what is their involvement in reducing the waste? Stakeholders such as the manufacturers must redesign packaging material. They must redesign the packaging material so that it is recyclable. Right, and this is a sign normally for something that can be recycled. Right, once you see that sign, it means that that item can be recycled. So once it's disposed of into the appropriate bin, it can be recycled so that less raw materials are used. So the manufacturers must redesign and rethink of packaging that is recyclable, and obviously they will increase the cost of that item. The next thing that one of the strategies that can be used is that the government must supply each household with recyclable bins. That means they must have a bin for each recyclable item, for example, with recyclable bins of different colors. Example, a bin for plastics, one for glass, one for cans, and one for probably paper. So in this way, lots and lots of money will be saved on, instead of the government going and sorting out that litter, the litter is already sorted out. So they can supply each household with bins of different colors so they can place different items to be recycled: plastic, glass, cans, and paper. Right. What else can the government actually do? You find they can actually improve the lives of people in the city by saving money. That means the lives of, if less waste is being disposed, it saves money, and that money can improve the lives of the people in Cape Town by building more homes for them. Right, so money is being saved. I think we've covered most of it now. Let's look at it. Right, let's look at the first one for about 7 marks. Where do we actually allocate the marks? Remember, they need to educate the residents on how to dispose of organic waste. Secondly, the manufacturers need to redesign the packaging items to be recyclable. Then the government must supply each household with recyclable bins to prevent sorting out, right? And then this will improve the lives of the people in that country or in that city because money is being saved. So these are the different strategies in which waste can be reduced. And people need to know that they can reuse. Also, they must be educated on reusing the packaging. They can reuse the packaging of items. Right. So those 5 strategies: educated on reusing, improving the lives by saving money. So remember, every statement, supply household with recyclable bins, so it prevents the sorting out. Right. So that is at least going to carry 7 to 8 marks in the form of a mini essay, but because it's saying it's discussed, then you don't have to put points, but you can formulate it in the form of a coherent paragraph like that. And there you've now made your discussion. So you think of the points and then you structure your paragraph. The next question, we go on to question 3.1. Right, 3.1. Study the table below showing fishing limits for 2 types of fish. Remember, we said there's an over-exploitation of fish. There's a demand of fish on the fishing industry. So we have a table here showing these 2 countries, and we're looking at 2 kinds of fish. Right. State what information is needed to set the fishing limit for each of the 2 countries. Remember, the demand for fish as a food is on the increase. So we need to sustain that particular fish. For example, tuna, shad, these fish are nearly becoming extinct. So what are the ways in which we need to conserve them? Right. Let's look at the 2 countries. If you look at fish 1, right, fish 1, in country A and country B, the amounts of fish or the quotas of fish here are lower compared to fish 2. The quotas in fish 2 is higher. So how will the country know what its quota must be? What information is needed to set the fishing limit or the quota? And the first thing is that the countries need to know the abundance of fish that is available. Right, so you remember that in population dynamics, the mark recapture method is used to determine the amount of a particular species, especially fish. So by determining the amount of fish found in a particular dam or in a particular river, they are now able to say, okay, we have approximately so much of fish, so we can limit our quota to this. So the information that's needed is, what is the abundance? What is the availability of fish in that particular ecosystem? So it is the abundance and the availability of the fish in that area. So that is the information that once that abundance is determined, or that availability or the number is determined, then they set the quotas. Okay, we go to the next one. Why is the quota for fish 2 higher than that of fish 1? Obviously, after determining the population size of fish 1 and fish 2, they can see that there is more fish 2 in both the countries. So the quota, that means they can tell you, okay, maybe for each person, fish 1, you can only catch 2 fish a day. But for fish 2, you can catch 5 a day. So there's a higher quota of fish 2 than fish 1 because there's more fish 2 available than fish 1. So why is the quota for fish 2 higher than that of fish 1? There is more availability of fish 2 in both countries. So both countries have a higher amount of fish 2. Therefore, the quota of fish 2 is higher. Right. Okay, the next question is question 3.3. The limits for both types of fish could be different in a few years' time. Give a reason for this. Now, if we're looking at this probably in, say, 2011, and if you look at maybe in 2014, right, these numbers can dwindle. So these numbers can go down, and as the fish numbers reduce, the quota will reduce. Once there's conservation and measures put into place, the quota was also obviously going to increase. So the limits for both types of fish could be different in a few years' time. Give a reason for this, and that means, right, as the fish population increase, the quota will increase, and if the numbers dwindle due to overfishing, the quota will reduce. Right. Then after conservation, methods used to retain the fish, to sustain that fish, after conservation methods or measures are put into place, the quota or the fish numbers will increase, and the quota will in turn increase. So it all depends on the availability. The more the fish that's available, the quota increases. Less fish available, less fish needs to be caught. Okay, so that will give you your mark allocation there of 2. Right, there has to be a relationship between quota and availability. Okay, let's go to the next one. Question 3.4. Right, explain 3 management strategies by which each country could try to keep within its fishing limits. This was a question that appeared in the grade 12 paper around, I think, 2008, in paper 2, environmental studies. Right, and here's an example whereby they want 3 management strategies, but it's giving you 6 marks, and that is where we have to put a statement and a reason. And the first management strategy will be, you've got to limit the bag numbers. Right, now limit the bag numbers means 1 mark. You get 1 mark. That means you cannot have 2 to 3 bags of fish that's caught on a daily basis. So you say, okay, this type of fish type 1, you need to catch just this particular bag size. There's a particular bag size, and you got to catch only that bag size of fish for that day. So you limit the bag number to prevent over-exploitation. And to say that to prevent over-exploitation means you get 2 marks now for that one. Right. The second strategy, right, you've got to set a fishing season, whereby you say, okay, fishing cannot be done throughout the year. There's just a particular season, and that season will not be the breeding season. So when it's the breeding season, there'll be no fishing, because you need the fish to reproduce. So there's a particular season after the breeding season. Okay, this particular season only, maybe in autumn, fishing is allowed. So set a fishing season to prevent the catching of young or immature fish. So you set a fishing season to prevent the catching of very young fish that have just hatched. So you set a fishing season to prevent the catching of young or immature fish. And The third strategy will be to have nets with small holes. Now you'll have a net to catch the fish. The net will have small holes so that you only catch the mature fish and not the young fish. You need the young fish to grow to a reproductive stage for them to breed and to produce more. So have nets with small holes to prevent fish that are young from being caught. Or you could say have nets with small holes to ensure fish that are reproductively mature are caught. Right. It's like if the young generation of the human species, all the young children die out and only the older ones are left, eventually the reproductive age will reduce and there'll be less humans that will be born. So obviously you've got to conserve the young so that the generations can continue. In the same way, you have to have a net with small holes so that the young fish do not escape that haven't yet reached a reproductive age. So we're actually conserving the young fish and allowing the ones that are very old to be caught. Right. So there you have limiting the bag size, setting a fishing season, have nets with small holes, right? And then obviously the fourth management strategy is you impose fines on those that transgress the law. So if you find that there's supposed to be one bag of a certain fish that's caught and somebody goes out with 2 bags, they need to be fined. And this will actually prevent over-exploitation. We now go to exercises that can be related to sustainability and conservation. Give the correct biological term for each of the following descriptions. Now, biological terminology may seem simple, but a lot of learners will put in the wrong word because they do not read the key words in that sentence. It's a chemical to kill insects. So if I put herbicide, it will be wrong because the herbicide is a weed killer. So I have to use insecticides. I can use pesticides because, for example, a fly can be a pest. So I can say insecticides or pesticides, but I cannot say herbicide. Okay. The next one, the term used to indicate the variety of living organisms and variety. Living means bio and variety will mean biodiversity. So that word is biodiversity, means a variety of living things. The release of harmful substances into the environment. Remember at the last session we spoke about the change, undesirable change in the natural resources like land, water and air. So if you release harmful substances to the environment, that is going to cause pollution. So that is pollution. It's the releasing of harmful substances to the environment, and that is pollution. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. So what is that development that meets the needs of the present? And that is conservation. If we are able to conserve, then we are able to use but still think of the future. So that word is conservation. Conservation strategies or conservation. Right. Carbon-based minerals such as oil and coal, which release heat energy during combustion. Remember that petrol is gained from crude oil and petroleum and tar are all extracts or byproducts of coal. So the carbon-based minerals such as oil and coal, which release energy, and that will be fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, because they're releasing energy and they are carbon-based. So that's fossil fuels. Right. That brings us to the end of this session. And what I need to highlight here, just to give you a few hints, is when you are writing an essay, make sure that it is in paragraphs, that proper biological terms are used, and that each paragraph must have a main theme. Okay, it must have, so there's paragraphs, proper biological terms, but each paragraph must have a main theme. For example, the one can be on what is conservation. So you write down what is conservation. You have to write down. Conservation is a method of using resources in a sustainable manner so that there is sufficient resources for future needs. Then you leave a line and say, what are the ways, for example, to sustain our resources? Right. Then you can say methods of sustaining is by recycling, reusing, and reducing the waste. Right. This prevents over-exploitation of the raw materials. Government and municipality got to rethink ways of reducing the waste by providing, for example, municipality bins of different colors. Educate the people. So these are the different ways or solutions. So there has to be paragraphs, and each paragraph must deal with a different theme. Then I want you to look at graphing skills. Graphs. Remember, a graph must have a heading, and the heading must have your variables. Remember, you have two variables. One is an independent variable that is normally controlled. Example, years. And the other one is your dependent variable, and that is not controlled. Example, the amounts. Right, what else? For graphing skills, you need to know that you need to use a ruler to draw your axis. For a pie chart, you need to use a protractor. You cannot draw a pie chart using a free hand like that. It will be incorrect. So you need to actually calculate your degrees. You need to draw your circle with a protractor, and from the center you plot your sectors, because when they are marking in an exam, a template is used to place over your diagram, and if your sectors of the pie chart do not match that template, you're going to lose marks for the proportions. Right, so you need to use a protractor, and you need to calculate the degree. Right, also remember to, when in a line graph, when you are using for a line graph, you need to join the points with a ruler. Do not join the points using a free hand, because they may not be accurate. Some can do that. Some can do this. So it's not going to be accurate. So please remember that when you're joining point to point, you need to use a ruler to join that 2 points to get an accurate measurement. Then remember that when you are drawing the axis, the x-axis, remember that this is 0, that's the point of origin. And when you are putting on your intervals, the intervals need to be plotted using a ruler. You need to use a proper interval, for example, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and not, for example, if on the table it was 1, 5, 14, 15, you cannot use 1, then 5, then 14, then 15. You'll lose marks for scale. So therefore, your scale has to be correct. Now, how does one determine the scale? You start off with the origin, and if your values are from, let's say, 1 to 15, the most appropriate scale will be 5, 10, 15. Rather than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's going to be too long. So 5, 10, 15, and remember, they must be at regular intervals. Also, you need to label your x-axis. What is, for example, years. And you've got to tell the unit in months, right? In months, maybe January, February, whatever it is, okay? So you got to label your x-axis. Let's say, for example, they're talking about length, and it'll be in millimeters. So that is a unit. Here they are talking about amount of CO2, and here it's in tons. So that's your unit. So you get marks for the label plus your unit, label plus your unit. And obviously, the correct label must be at the correct axis. Otherwise, you would lose mark for labeling. Right, so a plotting of a graph can approximately be around 13 marks. Please do not lose those marks. The heading, the plotting, the scaling, the units, all these need to be taken into account. Right, the one that is a very big problem to most learners is actually hypothesis testing. Remember that hypothesis testing you got to have two variables. Right. Let's, for example, look at the amount or the effect of sewage on oxygen levels. So the two variables are the effect of the sewage and the oxygen levels. So you're going to look at the oxygen level and so these are your two variables, and then you're going to look at a relationship between the two variables. And once you have a relationship between two variables and you predict the outcome of that relationship, it becomes a hypothesis. For example, high amounts of sewage released into a river will decrease the oxygen levels. So once you say, this is my hypothesis, high amounts of sewage released into a river will decrease the oxygen levels. So the amount of sewage and the oxygen level, that's the relationship. Now, what must one do? They need to carry out an investigation, a practical investigation. Right, you've observed something, that there's dead fish where there is sewage. So obviously the oxygen levels are low. So by observing that phenomena, you have made a hypothesis. Now you've got to test your hypothesis. And once you test it, your results will either say that your hypothesis is rejected or accepted. But now, how is one going to know whether the hypothesis is accepted or rejected? You've got to do an experiment. And that experiment will be a practical investigation, whereby you have learners who would go through to 3 different rivers in 3 different areas. Take a sample of water in the first river, sample of water in the second river, a sample of water in the third river. Remember, one river will be close to rural settlements. One river will be away from humans, very far, very clean water, and one will be somewhere near the city. So they will take the samples of the water, they will test it using indicators like mayfly larva. You know, mayfly larva is a good indicator. If mayfly larva is found in water, you know, they cannot live in polluted water. So if you find mayfly larva in water, it means that water is not polluted. So these are indicators. So they will test their water, they will plot their results on a table, compare the results, and then once you look at the results and you look at the numbers of the number of indicators of mayfly larva, remember, the more mayfly larva there is, the more oxygen there is. And then you look at it onto the table and you can check now, high amounts of sewage, no mayfly larva, no oxygen, more dead fish. So my hypothesis has been accepted that the more sewage or contamination a river has, the less oxygen there is. And that is all there is to hypothesis testing. So these factors, hypothesis testing, graphing skills, the formulation of an essay, how to write biological terms, matching, these are places, learners, where you can really score your marks, provided you know your work. You've got to know your work in order for you to apply it to the questions. So we come to the last part of environmental studies, and that's the last knowledge strand. I hope that you've learned a lot. Remember, the three parts to it again is the human influences on the environment. That is your greenhouse effect, the global warming, right? Deforestation, the ozone depletion, how it's caused. And then you look at the different types of pollution. Remember, the air, the water, the soil, the causes or the sources of each of the pollution, the effects of each pollution on human health and on the environment, and as well as possible solutions to solving the pollution problem. And then what are some of the things that are being overexploited, like the fish and the devil's claw and the African potato, and that is used for medicinal uses. How can we prevent overexploitation? And remember that a lot of litter and waste is becoming an increasing problem, not only to Cape Town, but throughout the world. And one of the ways to minimize the waste is the 3 R's, and that is to reuse items, to recycle them, and thereby reducing the waste. So please go over your work and make little concept mappings around each theme. Please remember that a concept mapping will be, for example, if you talk about air pollution, then for you to remember it easily, you say, right, strategies, educational campaigns, sources, and you write a whole lot of things, effects. And in one little concept mapping, a whole lot of notes can be summarized. So that concept mapping is a skill of studying. So I wish you all the best, and I want you to do well in your exams. From me, thank you.